Amid thousands of lights, one whispered sentence changes everything as Jungkook's secret leaves Jimin in tears and love rewrites destiny forever. The stadium lights trembled like a sky full of fallen stars as Jungkook suddenly caught Jimin's trembling hand before he could disappear behind the curtain. Thousands of glowing light sticks swayed in the darkness, their soft purple glow painting the night with a dreamlike warmth, but neither of them noticed the cheering crowd anymore. Time seemed to collapse into the fragile space between their racing heartbeats. Jungkook leaned closer, his breathing uneven after the exhausting performance, his fingers cold despite the heat of the stage. His eyes, usually filled with confidence, carried a fear Jimin had never seen before. For years he had hidden countless words beneath quiet smiles and playful laughter, believing silence was the safest way to protect the person standing in front of him. Tonight, however, silence had become heavier than truth itself. The music faded into the distance, fireworks froze in the night sky, and every camera continued recording without understanding the invisible battle taking place only inches away. Jungkook lowered his head until only Jimin could hear him. "If tomorrow the whole world forgets me, will you still stay beside me?" The sentence was barely louder than a heartbeat, yet it shattered every wall Jimin had carefully built around his emotions. His eyes widened, not because of the words alone, but because he finally understood the loneliness Jungkook had been carrying all this time. Memories flashed across his mind like scattered pieces of glass reflecting light. He remembered the countless nights Jungkook had quietly waited after rehearsals just to make sure everyone arrived home safely. He remembered the hidden exhaustion behind every bright smile, the small tremble in Jungkook's hands whenever he thought no one was watching, and the habit of looking at the night sky whenever difficult decisions had to be made. Jimin had always mistaken those moments for simple fatigue. Now he realized they were silent cries for someone to truly see him. A single tear escaped before he could stop it, then another. Soon his vision blurred as emotions he had buried for years flooded through him all at once. The audience noticed only that Jimin had suddenly begun crying under the sea of lights. Confused whispers spread through the stadium before thousands of people slowly fell silent. Even the members standing nearby exchanged worried glances, sensing something extraordinary had happened, although none of them had heard Jungkook's whisper. Jimin gently lifted Jungkook's face with both hands. His fingertips trembled as they brushed against Jungkook's cheeks. He saw fear there, but also hope, a fragile hope that had survived years of unanswered questions. Jimin smiled through his tears, the kind of smile born from unbearable sadness and immeasurable relief at the same time. "Even if every light in this stadium goes dark, even if every memory disappears, I will still recognize your heart," he whispered back. Jungkook's breathing stopped for a moment. The weight he had carried for so many years seemed to dissolve into the warm night air. His eyes became glossy, and despite every effort to remain composed, tears quietly rolled down his face. Around them, the audience began crying without fully understanding why. There was something undeniably real in the way the two stood beneath the endless lights, as though the world had briefly witnessed a conversation meant only for two souls who had wandered through years of silent devotion. The fireworks exploded again, filling the sky with silver blossoms that reflected inside their tear-filled eyes. Neither of them looked away. Neither of them cared about the cameras capturing every second. For the first time in years, Jungkook no longer felt afraid of tomorrow. For the first time, Jimin understood that love was not proven through grand speeches, but through the courage to ask the simplest, most vulnerable question. And beneath thousands of shimmering lights, surrounded by voices that had faded into distant echoes, both of them finally realized that the brightest light illuminating the night had never come from the stage. It had always lived quietly inside the hearts they had spent so long protecting. The applause continued like distant thunder, but to Jungkook and Jimin, it sounded as though it belonged to another world. They remained standing beneath the silver rain of fireworks, their hands still clasped together, unaware that thousands of people had quietly lowered their light sticks as tears spread from one face to another throughout the stadium. The music director hesitated before signaling the orchestra to stop completely. Silence settled over the arena, a silence so profound that even the fluttering confetti drifting through the air seemed impossibly loud. Jungkook slowly wiped the tears from Jimin's cheeks with the sleeve of his jacket, smiling with a tenderness that carried years of unspoken gratitude. Jimin laughed softly through his tears, embarrassed by how completely his emotions had escaped him, yet strangely relieved that he no longer wished to hide them. For the first time in countless years, neither of them felt the need to pretend they were stronger than they truly were. the dazzling lights reflected in their eyes as memories quietly resurfaced. Jimin remembered a rainy evening years earlier when he had nearly abandoned his dream after receiving harsh criticism. He had believed no one noticed him sitting alone behind the rehearsal building, staring at puddles that reflected the grey sky. Yet Jungkook had silently appeared beside him carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. He had said almost nothing that night. Instead, he had simply remained there until the rain stopped, proving that companionship sometimes spoke louder than advice. Jimin had never forgotten that kindness, although he had never fully understood why Jungkook always seemed to arrive exactly when he needed someone the most. Jungkook carried his own memories just as vividly. He remembered seeing Jimin secretly practicing until sunrise long after everyone else had gone home. He remembered hearing him laugh loudly during the day only to find him sitting alone on the rooftop at night, hugging his knees beneath the stars. Jimin had mastered the art of making everyone believe he was happy. Jungkook had mastered the art of protecting that illusion because he feared exposing the sadness behind it would only make the burden heavier. Their greatest mistake had never been the absence of love. It had been believing that love required silence. As the crowd slowly regained its voice, chants filled the stadium once more, but now they carried an entirely different emotion. They were no longer celebrating a performance. They were celebrating something deeply human, a moment of vulnerability powerful enough to unite strangers beneath one sky. Cameras zoomed toward them, capturing every expression, every trembling smile, every tear that glistened beneath the lights. Neither Jungkook nor Jimin attempted to hide anymore. They stood side by side, breathing in the cool night air scented with fireworks and fresh rain that had begun falling in tiny shimmering drops. The moisture cooled their flushed faces, mixing with tears until neither could tell where sorrow ended and happiness began. Jimin suddenly reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small velvet pouch that had remained there for years. Its edges had faded with time, the fabric worn from being carried everywhere. Jungkook looked at it with quiet confusion. "You've kept something with you this whole time?" he asked gently. Jimin nodded before carefully opening the pouch. Inside rested a simple silver ring attached to a thin chain. It was neither expensive nor decorated with precious stones. Its beauty came from the countless tiny scratches covering its surface, each one marking the passing of years. Jungkook stared in disbelief as recognition slowly appeared across his face. He had seen that ring once before in a small jewelry shop they had accidentally visited during a quiet afternoon long ago. Back then, Jimin had admired it for several minutes before smiling and saying it was beautiful because it looked imperfect, as though it already carried a lifetime of memories. Jungkook had assumed he had forgotten about it. He had been wrong. "I bought it the next day," Jimin admitted with a shy smile. "I wanted to give it to someone when I finally became brave enough to stop hiding my heart." Jungkook's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as Jimin gently placed the silver ring into his palm. It felt surprisingly warm despite the cool rain, as though it had absorbed years of silent hope. Jungkook looked down at the small circle of silver before closing his fingers around it. A quiet laugh escaped him, followed immediately by fresh tears. "All these years," he whispered. Jimin nodded. "All these years." Neither of them noticed that the rain had begun falling more heavily, washing away the last traces of smoke from the fireworks while the sea of lights continued glowing through the darkness like thousands of unwavering stars. The night no longer felt like the end of a concert. It felt like the beginning of a promise that had waited patiently through countless seasons, finally finding its voice beneath a sky bright enough to witness 2 hearts choosing honesty over fear. The gentle rain transformed the stadium into a shimmering ocean of light, every droplet catching the glow of thousands of light sticks until the entire night seemed wrapped in silver and violet. No one rushed to leave. The audience remained exactly where they were, as if instinctively sensing that the most unforgettable moment of the evening had only just begun. Jungkook stood motionless, the worn silver ring resting safely in his palm, while his heartbeat echoed louder than the fading music. It was astonishing to realize that something so small had carried the weight of so many silent years. Jimin watched him with a mixture of nervousness and relief. His smile was soft, but beneath it lay a fear he had hidden for far too long. Keeping the ring had never been difficult. Living with the possibility that he might never have the courage to give it away had been the true burden. Every birthday, every celebration, every farewell after another long schedule, he had reached into his pocket, felt the familiar shape beneath his fingertips and whispered to himself, "Not today." Tonight there would be no more "not today." Jungkook carefully lifted the chain holding the ring, letting it sway gently between them. Rainwater rolled from the silver surface like tiny diamonds before disappearing into the stage floor. His lips curved into a quiet smile, but his eyes revealed emotions too overwhelming for words. "I thought I was the only one hiding," he confessed. Jimin laughed softly, his voice trembling. "Looks like we were both terrible at telling the truth." The admission felt strangely liberating. Around them, the enormous screens projected every subtle expression. The audience could not hear every word, but they could read enough through their eyes, their smiles, and the quiet tears that refused to stop falling. Thousands of strangers smiled through their own emotions, witnessing not perfection but honesty. Jungkook slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. His fingers hesitated. For a brief second, fear returned. Then he drew out a tiny folded piece of paper, its edges worn and creased from years of being opened and folded again. Jimin stared at it. "You still have that," he whispered. Jungkook nodded. "I promised myself I would only read it aloud when I stopped being afraid." The paper looked ordinary, almost insignificant, yet it had traveled with Jungkook across countless cities, countries, and sleepless nights. It had survived airport terminals, hotel rooms, rehearsals, concerts, and endless flights. Sometimes he had almost thrown it away, believing the words inside belonged to a dream that would never become reality. Instead, he had always folded it again and slipped it back into his pocket. He unfolded it carefully. The rain had blurred some of the ink over the years, but every sentence remained readable. His voice was quiet enough that only Jimin could clearly hear it. "I wrote this after we met for the first time." Jimin's eyes widened. "So long ago." Jungkook smiled. "I didn't understand what I was feeling then. I only knew that every difficult day somehow became lighter after talking to you." He looked down at the faded handwriting. "My biggest wish isn't success, or applause, or being remembered forever." His voice grew even softer. "My biggest wish is that, years from now, when everything changes, you'll still smile when you see me walking toward you." Jimin covered his mouth as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. He realized that while he had been carrying a silver ring for years, Jungkook had been carrying words that weighed just as heavily. Neither of them had truly been alone. They had simply been protecting the same fragile dream from opposite sides. Jimin gently took the letter from Jungkook's trembling hands and folded it again with extraordinary care, almost as though it were something sacred. "You know what makes me happiest?" Jimin asked quietly. Jungkook shook his head. "You never stopped walking toward me." The sentence settled between them with the warmth of sunrise after a long winter. Jungkook lowered his head, unable to hide the tears gathering once again. He laughed softly at himself. "I've cried more tonight than I have in years." Jimin smiled. "Me too." For a long moment they simply stood there, letting the rain wash away every fear they had carried alone. The crowd slowly began raising their lights again. One by one, row after row, section after section, until the entire stadium glowed brighter than before. No one had been instructed to do it. No announcement had been made. It happened naturally, as though thousands of hearts had reached the same silent conclusion at exactly the same moment. Jungkook looked around in amazement. "They're beautiful." Jimin followed his gaze before smiling warmly. "They're reminding us that no light shines alone." The words lingered in the cool night air. Jungkook slipped the silver ring onto the chain once more and carefully placed it around his neck, close to his heart. "I'll wear it," he whispered. "Not because it's perfect, but because every scratch tells the story of someone who never gave up." Jimin nodded slowly. "And every day from now on." He gently rested his hand over the place where the ring now lay beneath Jungkook's jacket. "Let's stop hiding the truth from ourselves." The rain gradually softened into a fine mist. Above them, the clouds parted just enough for a handful of stars to appear. For the first time that night, both of them looked upward instead of backward, carrying with them not the weight of unspoken feelings, but the quiet certainty that some promises become stronger precisely because they spend years waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. Morning arrived slowly, wrapped in pale gold sunlight that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the quiet hotel overlooking the city. The excitement of the previous night had faded into a gentle stillness, yet neither Jungkook nor Jimin had truly slept. Their rooms were only a few steps apart, but countless thoughts had kept them awake until dawn. Outside, the streets buzzed with ordinary life, while inside the hotel everything felt suspended, as if time itself wished to linger a little longer around the emotions that had unfolded beneath the stadium lights. Jungkook stood barefoot beside the window, absent-mindedly touching the silver ring hanging from the chain around his neck. Every time his fingertips brushed against its worn surface, he remembered Jimin's trembling smile. The ring no longer felt like a secret hidden for years. It had become a quiet reminder that some promises survive precisely because they endure silence before finally finding their voice. A gentle knock echoed through the room. Jungkook smiled before opening the door. Jimin stood there holding 2 steaming cups of coffee and a small paper bag from a nearby bakery. His hair was still slightly messy from sleep, and the oversized sweater he wore made him look far younger than the world usually saw him. "I figured you'd be awake," Jimin said with a shy grin. "I don't think I could sleep after last night." "Neither could I." They laughed softly, the kind of laughter shared by people who no longer needed to explain themselves. The room quickly filled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread. They settled near the window, watching the city awaken beneath a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain. Cars moved quietly through the streets below while birds gathered along rooftops, singing as though welcoming an entirely new beginning. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Jimin finally broke it. "Do you remember the first gift you ever gave me?" Jungkook frowned thoughtfully. "The notebook." Jimin shook his head with an amused smile. "No, the headphones." Another shake of the head. Jungkook laughed. "I've forgotten." Jimin reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded a faded tissue, revealing a tiny silver guitar pick. "You gave me this after one rehearsal." Jungkook blinked in surprise. "You still have it." "You told me it was lucky." A warm smile spread across Jungkook's face. "I completely made that up." "I know." They both laughed. "But every difficult day after that," Jimin continued, gently turning the guitar pick between his fingers, "I kept it with me anyway." Jungkook looked at the tiny piece of metal. It was scratched from years of being carried around, its polished surface dulled by time. "You kept everything." Jimin nodded. "So did you." The realization settled gently between them. Neither had ever truly moved on from the quiet promises they had unknowingly made to each other years earlier. Jungkook leaned back in his chair, watching sunlight dance across the wooden floor. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" Jimin met his eyes. "You don't have to ask." Jungkook inhaled slowly. "When I was younger, I thought love meant protecting someone by carrying every burden alone." His voice remained calm, but sadness quietly lingered beneath each word. "My father used to say that people leave when life becomes difficult." He paused. "So I tried to become someone who never caused trouble." Jimin listened without interrupting. "I smiled even when I wanted to cry. I said I was fine even when I wasn't. I believed that if nobody saw my pain, nobody would have a reason to walk away." The confession left the room wrapped in silence. Jimin lowered his eyes. "I understand that more than you know." Jungkook looked at him. "When I was little," Jimin began quietly, "everyone praised me whenever I looked cheerful." He smiled faintly. "So I learned how to hide everything else." His fingers tightened around the guitar pick. "I became so good at pretending that eventually I couldn't tell where the performance ended and where I began." Jungkook's heart ached. The strongest person he knew had spent years feeling invisible beneath his own smile. Without saying a word, Jungkook reached across the table. Jimin placed his hand into his without hesitation. Neither tried to solve the other's pain. Neither searched for perfect advice. Sometimes understanding was enough. Outside the window, sunlight continued spreading across the city, illuminating streets still damp from last night's rain. The world looked brighter. Not because it had changed. Because they had. Hours later, they left the hotel through a quiet side entrance, wearing simple clothes that allowed them to blend into the crowd. They wandered through narrow streets lined with small cafes, flower shops, and old bookstores, untouched by the hurried rhythm of the modern city. The crisp scent of roasted coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the fragrance of fresh jasmine blooming from balconies overhead. They stopped before a tiny antique shop tucked between two brick buildings. The owner, an elderly woman with gentle eyes, welcomed them with a warm smile. "Take your time," she said softly. Inside, shelves overflowed with clocks, music boxes, handwritten letters, vintage cameras, and weathered picture frames carrying forgotten histories. Jimin wandered toward an old wooden music box. When he opened it, a delicate melody filled the room. Jungkook froze. "I know that song." "So do I," Jimin whispered. It was the melody they had unknowingly hummed together during countless rehearsals, whenever exhaustion made conversation impossible. Neither of them had ever realized where it came from. The elderly shopkeeper smiled knowingly. That music box belonged to a couple. She gently dusted its polished lid. They visited this shop every anniversary. "What happened to them?" Jimin asked. The woman looked toward the sunlit window. "One of them passed away many years ago." Silence filled the room. "But before that," she continued with a peaceful smile, "they promised each other something." Jungkook listened carefully. "They said memories don't disappear. They simply wait patiently inside the hearts that keep choosing love." Neither Jungkook nor Jimin spoke. They simply looked at one another. For reasons neither could fully explain, the words felt strangely familiar. Almost as though life itself had quietly repeated the promise they had already begun making beneath thousands of lights the night before. When they finally stepped back outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming flowers, while the silver ring resting against Jungkook's heart caught the sunlight for a single brilliant moment, shining not like a treasure, but like a memory that had finally found its home. The afternoon drifted quietly toward evening as golden sunlight stretched across the narrow streets, turning every window into a mirror of amber light. Jungkook and Jimin walked side by side without any destination, allowing the city to guide them through quiet alleys where ivy climbed old brick walls and flower boxes overflowed with colorful blossoms. Children laughed in a nearby park, bicycle bells echoed softly through the air, and somewhere in the distance, a violinist played a melody gentle enough to make even hurried strangers slow their pace. For the first time in years, neither of them was rushing toward another rehearsal, another performance, or another responsibility. The world seemed unusually generous, giving them a few precious hours in which they could simply exist as two ordinary people. Jimin stopped in front of a small bridge, crossing a narrow river that reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. "I've always liked bridges," he murmured. Jungkook leaned against the wooden railing. "Why? They don't belong to one side or the other." Jungkook smiled. "They connect people." Jimin nodded. "Even when the distance feels impossible." The breeze carried the scent of water and blooming lavender from a nearby garden. Tiny ripples shimmered beneath them as leaves floated lazily downstream, disappearing beneath the bridge before emerging again on the other side. Jungkook watched them quietly. "I spent so many years worrying about what I might lose," he admitted. "I forgot to appreciate what was already beside me." Jimin turned toward him. "We both did." His voice carried no regret, only understanding. They remained there until the church bells, somewhere across the city, rang 6 slow notes. The sound awakened another memory. "Come with me," Jimin said suddenly. "Where's?" "You'll see." A few minutes later they arrived at the edge of a quiet hill overlooking the city skyline. At its highest point stood an enormous oak tree whose branches spread like protective arms across the grassy field. The trunk was scarred by time, its bark marked with initials carved decades earlier by countless visitors. Jimin smiled the moment he saw it. "I found this place years ago. You never told me." "I almost did." He laughed softly. "But every time I wanted to, something interrupted us." They walked beneath the massive tree. The air smelled of fresh grass warmed by the fading sunlight. Small white flowers swayed gently around its roots, while birds prepared to return to their nests before nightfall. Jimin reached into his backpack and carefully removed a weathered notebook. Its leather cover had faded with age. The corners were bent. Several pages were held together by tape. Jungkook recognized it immediately. "You still write in that?" "Almost every day." Jimin opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwritten thoughts, sketches, unfinished songs, pressed flowers, and tiny photographs tucked between paragraphs. He turned to the first page. The date written there was from many years ago. "I started this because I was afraid." Jungkook looked at him curiously. "Afraid of forgetting?" Jimin smiled sadly. "No." He gently ran his fingertips across the faded ink. "I was afraid that one day I'd become someone who forgot how to feel." The confession lingered in the quiet evening. Jungkook sat beside him beneath the tree. Jimin continued turning the pages. Some contained joyful memories. Others were stained by tears that had blurred the ink forever. One page held only a single sentence. "Today he smiled, and somehow my entire day became brighter." Jungkook stared at the words. "That's you." Silence settled between them again. Another page read. "I wish he could see himself the way everyone else does." Then another. "He's always protecting everyone. Who protects him?" Jungkook lowered his eyes. He had never imagined someone had been watching over him so carefully all these years. Jimin closed the notebook. "I never intended anyone to read this." "Why are you showing me now?" "Because I don't want fear to keep writing the rest of my story." The evening wind gently rustled the branches overhead. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns across the pages. Jungkook slowly removed the folded letter he had carried for years. Without speaking, he placed it inside the notebook. "It belongs here." Jimin looked at him with surprise. "Are you sure?" Jungkook nodded. "It was written for you." Jimin carefully closed the notebook around the letter. Two secrets that had lived separately for years were finally resting together. They remained beneath the oak tree until twilight painted the sky with deep shades of blue and crimson. Stars gradually appeared one by one. The first evening breeze grew cooler. Far below, the city lights awakened, sparkling like another sky spread across the earth. Jungkook lay back on the grass. "I used to think stars were lonely." Jimin lay beside him. "I used to think they were too far away." Neither looked at the other. Both stared upward. After a long silence, Jimin quietly spoke. "My grandmother used to tell me something." "What?" "She said people don't enter our lives by accident." Jungkook smiled faintly. "What did she mean?" "She believed every important meeting happens twice." Jungkook turned toward him. "Twice?" "The first time we meet someone's face." Jimin's eyes reflected the growing starlight. "The second time we finally meet their heart." Jungkook felt warmth spread through his chest. "I think last night was the second time." Jimin smiled. "I think so too." For several peaceful minutes, they simply listened to the gentle chorus of crickets beginning their nightly song. The wind moved softly through the ancient branches above them, carrying away years of silence and returning only calm. Neither noticed the elderly groundskeeper watching them from a distance with a quiet smile. He had tended the old oak tree for nearly 40 years. He had witnessed countless people carve names into its bark, make promises beneath its branches, and leave believing the tree possessed some mysterious magic. As he locked the small gate for the evening, he looked once more toward the two figures resting beneath the oak. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "The strongest promises are never carved into wood. They are carved into the courage to stay." His words disappeared into the cool night breeze, unnoticed by Jungkook and Jimin, who continued gazing at the endless stars above them, finally understanding that love was never measured by the number of words spoken, but by every quiet moment in which two hearts chose, again and again, not to walk away. The night wrapped the hill in quiet serenity as countless stars shimmered above the ancient oak tree. The city below glowed like a sea of scattered diamonds, its distant sounds softened by the cool evening breeze. Jungkook and Jimin remained lying on the grass, their shoulders almost touching, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. It was the kind of silence earned only after years of carrying emotions too heavy for words. A shooting star suddenly streaked across the sky. Jimin smiled instinctively. "You saw it?" Jungkook nodded. "My grandmother used to tell me not to make wishes on shooting stars." Jimin turned toward him. "Really, why?" She believed wishes should be spoken to people, not to the sky. Jimin laughed quietly. "That sounds exactly like something she'd say." Jungkook smiled, though his expression gradually softened into nostalgia. "I never understood it when I was younger. And now I think she was right." His gaze shifted from the stars to Jimin. "The sky can't answer, but people can." The words lingered gently between them. Jimin looked back toward the heavens. "I spent years wishing someone would understand me." He exhaled slowly. "I never realized that someone was standing beside me the whole time." The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth across the hill. Somewhere nearby an owl called into the darkness. The world felt wonderfully still. Eventually they rose and began walking down a narrow stone path leading away from the oak tree. Small lanterns lined the trail, casting warm pools of golden light across the ground. Their shadows stretched side by side, sometimes separating as the path curved, only to meet again beneath the next lantern. Neither noticed the quiet symbolism. The path eventually led them to a peaceful lakeside, where the water reflected the moon so perfectly, it seemed as though another sky rested beneath the surface. Several small wooden boats floated gently against the dock. Jimin stopped. "I've never been here at night." Jungkook smiled. "Neither have I." Without thinking too much about it, they untied one of the empty rowboats and climbed aboard. Jungkook picked up the oars while Jimin settled opposite him, trailing his fingertips lightly through the calm water. Each stroke sent shimmering ripples across the lake, breaking the moon's reflection into countless fragments before allowing it to become whole again. Jimin watched quietly. "That's beautiful." "What is?" "The water." Jungkook glanced around. "It keeps breaking." He smiled. "And it keeps putting itself back together." Neither of them realized how closely the lake resembled their own hearts. Halfway across, Jungkook rested the oars. The boat drifted silently. Above them, the stars reflected on the water, until it became impossible to tell where the sky ended and the lake began. Jimin reached into his notebook again. "I wrote something this morning." "You did?" "I wasn't sure if I'd ever read it to anyone." Jungkook nodded encouragingly. "I'm listening." Jimin opened to the newest page. His voice was barely louder than the gentle movement of the water. "I used to believe love was finding someone extraordinary." He paused. "But I was wrong." He continued. "Love is finding the one person who quietly notices when your smile is just a little smaller than yesterday." Jungkook lowered his eyes. Jimin smiled faintly before reading on. "It's the person who remembers the coffee you pretend not to like but secretly order whenever you're exhausted." A soft laugh escaped Jungkook. "And the one who notices your hands shaking before you even realize you're afraid." Jimin closed the notebook. "I think that's what love feels like." Silence followed. Not an uncertain silence. A peaceful one. Jungkook looked across the moonlit water. Can I tell you a secret? You've already told me your biggest one. I forgot one. Jimin smiled. I'm still listening. Jungkook laughed softly. I hate thunderstorms. Jimin blinked. You do. I always have. You never told anyone. I didn't want people thinking I was childish. Jimin's expression warmed. When I was younger. He hesitated. I used to count between lightning and thunder because I thought if I counted correctly, nothing bad would happen. Jungkook looked at him in surprise. I used to do that too. They stared at one another for a second. Then both burst into genuine laughter. It echoed across the quiet lake. The kind of laughter that comes only when two people discover they have been carrying the same little fears all along. Their laughter gradually faded into smiles. Jungkook picked up the oars again. As they slowly returned toward the dock, clouds drifted across the moon. A light fog began rising from the lake, wrapping everything in a dreamlike glow. By the time they reached the shore, the town had grown almost completely silent. Only one building remained brightly illuminated. An old library. Its tall windows glowed warmly against the night. Jimin tilted his head. It's still open. A small sign beside the entrance read, Midnight Reading Night, everyone welcome. Jungkook smiled. Want to go in? Jimin nodded immediately. Inside, rows upon rows of books stretched toward the high wooden ceiling. The comforting scent of old paper and polished wood surrounded them. Only a handful of visitors wandered quietly between the shelves. An elderly librarian greeted them with a gentle smile. First time here. It is, Jimin answered. She nodded knowingly. Then you should each choose one book. Why? Because every important chapter in life deserves another one waiting beside it. Jungkook and Jimin exchanged amused glances before wandering into different aisles. Neither knew exactly what they were looking for. Neither realized that before the night ended, they would each unknowingly reach for the very same book at the exact same moment, discovering that sometimes destiny did not announce itself with grand miracles. Sometimes it simply waited quietly on the same shelf until two hands reached for the same story together. The library was wrapped in an almost sacred silence. Tall oak shelves stretched toward the ceiling, each filled with books whose worn spines carried the fingerprints of countless lives. Warm amber lamps bathed every aisle in a soft glow, while the scent of old paper, cedar wood, and freshly brewed tea drifted gently through the room. Outside, the moonlight rested against the stained glass windows, turning the quiet building into a refuge untouched by the hurried rhythm of the world. Jungkook wandered slowly between the history shelves, while Jimin explored the section devoted to poetry and journals. Neither spoke. The only sounds were the gentle turning of pages and the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock mounted above the entrance. Without realizing it, both stopped before the very same shelf. At exactly the same moment, two hands reached toward a faded blue book resting in the center. Their fingers touched. Jungkook looked up. Jimin was already smiling. I guess we have the same taste. Or the same curiosity. They carefully pulled the book free together. Its cover was simple, decorated only with a small silver constellation. No title. No author's name. Only a single sentence embossed beneath the stars. For the hearts brave enough to remember. Jimin frowned slightly. That's unusual. The elderly librarian appeared beside them almost soundlessly. Very few people choose that one. Jungkook looked at her. Why? She smiled kindly. Because most people walk past it. She gently brushed away an invisible speck of dust from its cover. The story inside isn't famous. What is it about? Jimin asked. The librarian's eyes sparkled. It depends on who's reading. Before either of them could ask another question, she quietly walked away to help another visitor. Curiosity replaced their confusion. They carried the mysterious book to a small reading table beside the tallest window. Moonlight spilled across its pages as Jungkook carefully opened the cover. The first page contained no chapter title, only a handwritten sentence. The greatest fear is not losing someone, but believing you were never truly seen. Both fell silent. Jimin slowly turned the page. The story described two travelers who wandered through different seasons of life, unknowingly protecting each other from afar. Sometimes they met briefly before parting again. Sometimes they missed one another by only a few moments. Each believed they walked alone. Neither realized that every difficult decision made by one quietly changed the other's path. Jungkook continued reading. The deeper they went into the story, the more strangely familiar it became. The travelers loved quiet places. One collected letters. The other kept small keepsakes no one else understood. One feared becoming a burden. The other feared arriving too late. Jimin looked up. This feels a... Jungkook finished the sentence. You like us? Neither laughed. The resemblance was too extraordinary. As they reached the final pages, they found something unexpected. Several blank sheets. No ending. Only another handwritten line. Every reader must write the last chapter for themselves. Jimin gently closed the book. I think that's beautiful. Jungkook nodded. It reminds us that no one else gets to decide how our story ends. The antique clock above the entrance chimed softly. Midnight. The librarian approached carrying 2 fountain pens. She placed them quietly beside the book. You may leave a sentence. Jimin looked surprised. Anyone can. Only those who find the book together. The old woman's smile was gentle. It has always been that way. Without discussing it, Jungkook picked up the first pen. His handwriting remained careful despite the slight tremble in his fingers. He wrote, "Thank you for staying long enough for silence to become understanding." He handed the pen to Jimin. Jimin read the sentence twice before smiling warmly. Beneath it he wrote, "Some hearts arrive quietly, yet they become the safest place we will ever know." The ink shimmered briefly before drying into the page. The librarian closed the book with remarkable care. I think it was waiting for both of you. She returned it to the same shelf where it had rested before. Neither Jungkook nor Jimin questioned her words. Some mysteries felt more meaningful when left unexplained. As they stepped outside, the cool night air greeted them once again. The streets had emptied. The city had fallen asleep. Only the street lamps remained awake, casting long ribbons of golden light across the cobblestones. They began walking without speaking. Not because there was nothing left to say, because words no longer carried the same urgency. A quiet bakery near the corner had just opened for the early morning crowd. The rich aroma of fresh bread drifted into the street. Jimin smiled. I'm hungry. Jungkook laughed. You always are after emotional conversations. I can't help it. Inside, the baker welcomed them with warm pastries still steaming from the oven. They chose 2 simple croissants and sat by the window while dawn slowly painted the eastern sky with soft shades of pink and gold. People gradually began filling the streets. Cyclists rode to work. Children wearing backpacks laughed as they hurried toward school. An elderly couple walked hand in hand beneath blooming cherry trees. Life moved gently forward. Jungkook watched the awakening city. You know, what? I used to think extraordinary moments only happened on big stages. Jimin looked out at the ordinary morning unfolding beyond the glass. I don't anymore. Jungkook nodded. I think the most extraordinary moments happen when nobody's trying to create them. Jimin smiled. Like sharing breakfast. Or finding the same book. Or sitting beneath an old tree. Or whispering one honest sentence. They both laughed quietly. The silver ring resting against Jungkook's heart caught the first ray of sunrise filtering through the bakery window. Its worn surface glowed warmly, no longer carrying only the memories of years gone by. Now it reflected something entirely different. Not a promise waiting to be spoken, but a promise already being lived. Outside, the city welcomed a brand new day, and for the first time in a very long time, Jungkook and Jimin stepped into it without hiding any part of themselves, discovering that the brightest journeys are not measured by how far two people travel, but by how honestly they choose to walk beside one another, one sunrise at a time. The morning unfolded with a quiet elegance that neither Jungkook nor Jimin wanted to disturb. The bakery slowly filled with the comforting sounds of ordinary life, the clinking of porcelain cups, soft conversations between strangers, and the warm crackle of fresh bread emerging from the old stone oven. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, painting golden patterns across the wooden floor as the city awakened one gentle heartbeat at a time. Jungkook rested his chin on his hand while watching people pass outside. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "how many lives cross each other without realizing how important they could become?" Jimin stirred the foam in his coffee before answering. "Every day." He smiled faintly. "I think that's why kindness matters." Jungkook looked at him. "You never know which moment someone will remember forever." His words settled warmly between them. They finished breakfast slowly, reluctant to let the peaceful morning end. Before leaving, the elderly baker wrapped 2 small cinnamon rolls in brown paper and handed them over with a gentle smile. "For later," she said. Jungkook blinked in surprise. "But we didn't order these." "I know." She looked at them kindly. "Sometimes the sweetest gifts are the ones nobody expects." Jimin thanked her sincerely. As they stepped back onto the quiet street, the scent of cinnamon followed them into the crisp morning air. The city looked different in daylight. The streets that had glowed beneath moonlight now shimmered beneath the soft brilliance of the rising sun. Flower stalls lined the sidewalks, their colorful bouquets filling the air with the fragrance of roses, lilies, and lavender. Musicians performed gentle melodies in the nearby square, while children chased pigeons through fountains sparkling like crystal. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary, and somehow that ordinary beauty felt extraordinary. They wandered without a map, laughing over small things they had never before taken time to notice. A sleepy cat stretching lazily in front of a bookstore, a little boy proudly carrying a loaf of bread almost bigger than himself, an elderly painter quietly capturing the morning skyline on canvas. Eventually they reached a narrow street neither of them remembered seeing before. At its end stood a tiny photography studio. The sign above the entrance read, "Moments that stay." Jimin slowed his steps. "I like that name." "So do I." The display window contained dozens of black and white photographs. None were glamorous. None were staged. Each captured simple moments. A father tying his daughter's shoelaces. 2 elderly friends laughing over tea. A young couple dancing barefoot beneath unexpected rain. A child sleeping peacefully on a train. Jungkook stared quietly. "They're beautiful. They feel real," Jimin whispered. Before either could say another word, the studio door opened. An elderly photographer stepped outside, carrying an old vintage camera around his neck. He smiled warmly. "Would you too like a photograph?" Jungkook hesitated. "We're not really dressed for one." The old man chuckled. "The best photographs are never planned." His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human hearts. "They simply happen." Jimin exchanged a glance with Jungkook. Then both nodded. The photographer guided them into a small garden behind the studio. It was breathtaking. White roses climbed stone arches. Tiny fountains murmured quietly beneath flowering trees. Butterflies drifted lazily through beams of sunlight. The air smelled of jasmine and fresh earth. "This is incredible," Jungkook whispered. "I've cared for this garden for 40 years, the photographer replied. It teaches patience. He adjusted the camera carefully. I'm not looking for perfect smiles. He smiled gently. I'm waiting for the moment you forget I'm here. They stood together beneath an arch of blooming roses. At first both smiled awkwardly. The photographer lowered his camera. Too careful. He waited. They began talking quietly, remembering old rehearsals, laughing about forgotten dance mistakes, arguing playfully over who always arrived late. Jimin suddenly burst into genuine laughter after Jungkook dramatically imitated an old rehearsal instructor. Without warning, click, the shutter echoed softly. Neither noticed. They kept laughing. Jungkook accidentally brushed flour from breakfast off Jimin's sweater. Jimin retaliated by lightly pushing Jungkook's shoulder. Another laugh. Click. The photographer continued patiently. No instructions. No poses. Only moments. Finally, Jungkook looked at Jimin with the same quiet expression he had worn beneath the sea of lights that unforgettable night. There were no tears now. Only peace. Only gratitude. Jimin smiled back. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The photographer slowly lifted the camera one final time. Click. He lowered it with quiet satisfaction. There. That's the one. Jungkook looked curious. You haven't even developed it. I don't need to. The old man smiled knowingly. I've learned to recognize photographs that carry truth. Inside the studio, they waited while he developed the film using traditional methods. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and old paper. Photographs slowly emerged beneath the red safety light, one after another, until finally the last image appeared. Jimin stared silently. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no perfect poses, only the two of them standing beneath white roses, smiling at one another as though the rest of the world had quietly disappeared. The photographer carefully placed the photograph inside a simple wooden frame. Take it. Jungkook reached for his wallet. The old man gently shook his head. It's already been paid for. Both looked confused. By whom? The photographer glanced toward the garden. Sometimes life settles old debts in unexpected ways. Neither pressed him further. As they stepped outside carrying the framed photograph together, the bells of a nearby church began ringing across the city. The sound floated gently through the warm morning breeze. Jungkook looked down at the photograph. It's strange. What is? For years I was afraid of photographs. Jimin smiled. Because they captured moments you couldn't hold on to. Jungkook nodded. But this one. He held the frame carefully against his chest. It doesn't remind me of something that's over. Jimin looked at him warmly. It reminds you of something that's finally beginning. They continued walking beneath the flowering trees, the framed photograph safely between them, while sunlight illuminated the quiet street ahead. It no longer felt like they were searching for a destination. Every shared step had already become one, and every ordinary moment they embraced together quietly proved that the most unforgettable memories are never created by extraordinary places, but by the hearts that choose to see each other completely. The framed photograph rested carefully in Jungkook's hands as they continued their unhurried walk through the city. The morning had matured into a bright afternoon, and the streets were alive with color. Flower petals drifted across the sidewalks whenever a gentle breeze passed, musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies, and cafes overflowed with people sharing conversations that seemed wonderfully ordinary. Jimin glanced at the photograph again. It still doesn't feel real. Jungkook smiled. Which part? That we are finally living without pretending. Jungkook lowered his eyes thoughtfully. I think we are still learning. The sentence carried neither sadness nor uncertainty. Only honesty. They reached a quiet square where an enormous fountain stood at its center. Crystal clear water rose gracefully before falling into the circular basin with a soothing rhythm. Around it, artists displayed paintings, while children tossed tiny paper boats into the shallow pools. Near the fountain stood a young violinist. His music floated gently through the square. The melody immediately caught Jimin's attention. "I know this song." Jungkook listened carefully. "So do I." It was the same melody from the old music box they had discovered in the antique shop. Neither of them had expected to hear it again. Almost unconsciously, they followed the music until they stood only a few feet away from the musician. When the final note faded, the young violinist smiled politely. "You two seem to know it." Jimin nodded. "Where did you learn it?" "My grandfather taught me." He carefully placed the violin into its case. He always said this melody belonged to people who found each other after a long journey. Jungkook exchanged a quiet glance with Jimin. The coincidence felt almost impossible. "Did he write it?" Jungkook asked. The violinist smiled. "No." He said nobody knows who composed it. He only believed the melody appears whenever two hearts are finally ready to stop hiding. The words lingered long after the musician had disappeared into the afternoon crowd. Neither Jungkook nor Jimin tried to explain the strange series of encounters they had experienced over the past 2 days. The antique shop, the mysterious book, the photographer, now this melody. It felt as though the city itself had quietly been leading them from one forgotten memory to another. They continued walking until they reached a botanical garden nestled beside a peaceful river. The entrance was framed by climbing roses and ancient stone pillars. Inside, winding paths disappeared beneath towering trees whose branches filtered sunlight into countless shimmering beams. Everything smelled of fresh leaves and blooming flowers. Butterflies floated lazily above colorful gardens, while distant birds filled the air with soft songs. Jimin inhaled deeply. "I wish we could stay here forever." Jungkook laughed gently. "You'd get bored." "I don't think so. You always need something exciting." Jimin thought for a moment. "I used to." He looked around the peaceful garden. "Now I think peace is exciting enough." Jungkook smiled. "I understand." They wandered deeper into the gardens until they reached a quiet greenhouse. Inside grew thousands of orchids in every imaginable color. The warm, humid air carried a delicate floral fragrance that wrapped around them like an embrace. At the center stood a single white orchid unlike the others. A small plaque beneath it read, "Bloomed after 12 years." Jimin knelt to read it more closely. 12 years. An elderly gardener noticed their curiosity. "It refused to bloom." "For 12 years." The gardener nodded. Everyone believed something was wrong with it. "What changed?" The old man smiled while gently watering nearby flowers. "Nothing." They looked at him puzzled. It simply needed exactly the right season. Jungkook gazed quietly at the white blossom. "Perfect. Elegant. Patient." The gardener continued. "Some flowers bloom quickly. Others carry their beauty quietly until the time is right." He looked toward them with kind eyes. "Neither is late." His words settled gently into both their hearts. As they thanked him and continued walking, Jungkook suddenly stopped beside a small wooden bench beneath a flowering magnolia tree. He sat down. Jimin joined him. Neither spoke immediately. The breeze carried dozens of pale petals through the air. They landed softly around their feet before continuing their graceful journey across the garden. After several quiet moments, Jungkook finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. If you could relive one day." He looked ahead thoughtfully. "And which day would you choose?" Jimin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched a little girl chasing butterflies with boundless joy. Finally, he smiled. I wouldn't choose a day. Jungkook looked surprised. I'd choose a moment. Which one? Jimin turned toward him. The moment you whispered. His voice softened. If tomorrow the whole world forgets me, will you still stay beside me? Jungkook lowered his eyes. I'd relive it too. Really? Yes. Even though you were terrified. Jungkook nodded slowly. Because that was the first moment I stopped hiding. Jimin's smile warmed. I think courage always feels frightening. The afternoon sunlight gradually shifted toward gold. Long shadows stretched across the garden paths. Visitors slowly began leaving. Only a handful remained. Jungkook reached into his pocket and unfolded the photograph they had received that morning. He studied it carefully, then looked at Jimin. I've been thinking. What about? Photographs freeze time. Jimin nodded. But memories. He gently touched the silver ring resting beneath his shirt. Keep it alive. Jimin quietly rested his hand over Jungkook's. Neither spoke again. They simply sat beneath the magnolia tree, while petals continued drifting around them like silent blessings from the passing afternoon. In that peaceful garden, surrounded by flowers that had bloomed in their own perfect seasons, they finally understood that neither of them had arrived too early or too late in each other's hearts. Every fear, every silence, every year of waiting had simply been preparing them for the quiet happiness they now shared, a happiness that required no audience, no applause, and no grand declaration, only two people who had finally learned that love grows strongest when given the patience to bloom in its own time. Evening settled gently over the botanical garden, covering the winding paths with a soft amber glow as antique lanterns awakened one by one beneath the trees. The last visitors slowly disappeared beyond the stone gates, leaving behind only the quiet murmur of leaves dancing in the breeze and the distant song of birds returning to their nests. The world seemed to exhale, inviting everything to slow down. Jungkook and Jimin remained seated beneath the magnolia tree for a little longer, watching pale petals drift lazily across the grass. It feels strange, Jungkook whispered. What does? I've spent years chasing tomorrow. He smiled faintly. But today is the first day I don't want to hurry. Jimin looked toward the sunset, painting the sky with shades of crimson, gold, and lavender. I think that's what peace feels like. They rose from the bench and continued walking toward the river that bordered the garden. The water reflected the evening sky so perfectly that every ripple carried fragments of glowing clouds downstream. Small lanterns floated upon the surface, each carrying a tiny candle whose flame flickered gently against the gathering darkness. A wooden sign near the riverbank caught Jimin's attention. Lantern Festival tonight. Families, couples, and elderly neighbors had quietly gathered along the shore. Some wrote messages on delicate paper lanterns before placing them carefully into the water. Others simply watched in silence as hundreds of tiny lights floated together toward the horizon. Jimin smiled. I've always wanted to do this. Jungkook glanced toward a nearby table where volunteers offered blank lanterns and brushes. Then let's. They each received a small lantern. For several moments, neither wrote anything. The blank paper somehow felt intimidating. Finally, Jungkook picked up the brush. He wrote slowly. Thank you for finding me before I lost myself. He placed the brush down. Jimin read the words quietly. His eyes softened. Then he lifted his own brush. Thank you for teaching me that being understood is the gentlest kind of home. The ink dried beneath the fading sunlight. Without another word, they carried the lantern together toward the edge of the river. The water felt cool against their fingertips. They lowered the lantern carefully until it floated freely among hundreds of others. For a few seconds it remained beside the shore. Then the gentle current carried it forward. They watched silently as it joined the countless glowing lights drifting into the twilight. It's beautiful, Jimin whispered. Jungkook nodded. It reminds me of the stadium. Jimin smiled. Only quieter. A little girl standing nearby suddenly tugged on Jungkook's sleeve. She couldn't have been older than 7. She held a tiny folded paper crane. You dropped this. Jungkook looked confused. I don't think it's mine. The little girl tilted her head. It has your name. She handed it to him before skipping happily back toward her parents. Jungkook carefully unfolded the paper crane. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. The brightest lights are the ones we carry home. There was no signature. No explanation. Jimin looked around. No one seemed to be watching them. Another mystery. Another quiet gift. Instead of questioning it, Jungkook folded the paper once more and tucked it safely beside the old letter in his pocket. I'll keep it. I knew you would. Night settled completely. The festival gradually transformed into a sea of floating stars upon the river. Music drifted softly through the cool air as a small orchestra played gentle melodies from a nearby pavilion. Couples danced beneath strings of warm lights suspended between old willow trees. Children laughed while chasing glowing fireflies. The atmosphere felt almost timeless. Jimin suddenly extended his hand. Dance with me. Jungkook blinked. Here? Why not? We're in the middle of a festival. Exactly. Jungkook laughed. You know I can't say no to you. The orchestra began playing a slow waltz. Without caring who might be watching, Jungkook placed one hand gently around Jimin's shoulder while their other hands met naturally between them. They moved slowly. Not with perfect choreography. Not with polished elegance. Just two people allowing the music to guide their hearts. Around them, the lanterns continued floating quietly along the river. The breeze carried the scent of cherry blossoms and candle wax. Jimin rested his forehead lightly against Jungkook's. Do you hear that? The music. No. Jungkook listened carefully. The river. The wind. The laughter. The rustling trees. Everything blended into one peaceful symphony. I hear life, he answered softly. Jimin smiled. So do I. When the music ended, neither stepped away immediately. The silence that followed felt just as beautiful as the melody itself. Above them, the first full moon of the season rose gracefully into the night sky. Its silver light bathed the entire riverside in a gentle glow. Jungkook looked upward. My grandmother also used to say something about full moons. What did she say? She believed they're reminders. Of what? That even when we're only given pieces of light. He looked at Jimin with quiet affection. We can still become whole. Jimin's eyes shimmered beneath the moonlight. He gently squeezed Jungkook's hand. I think tonight proves she was right. They remained by the river long after the festival grew quieter, watching the final lanterns disappear into the distance. Neither wished for the night to last forever. They had finally learned something far more comforting. Beautiful moments didn't have to be endless to become unforgettable. Sometimes they only needed to be genuine. As they walked home beneath the moonlit sky, the silver ring rested peacefully against Jungkook's heart, the framed photograph remained carefully tucked beneath Jimin's arm, and the folded paper crane rested safely inside Jungkook's pocket. Together they carried not only keepsakes, but living reminders that the greatest treasures are never measured by their price or rarity, but by the love, trust, and quiet courage they preserve long after a single extraordinary night has become a cherished memory. The moon remained high above the sleeping city as Jungkook and Jimin slowly walked away from the river. The lantern festival had faded into the distance, leaving only the gentle sound of flowing water behind them. Their footsteps echoed softly along the quiet stone streets, where rows of old buildings glowed beneath warm street lamps. The night felt calm, almost protective, as though the city itself wished to guard the peaceful happiness they had finally found. Neither hurried. For once, there was nowhere they needed to be except beside each other. Jimin glanced at the folded paper crane, resting safely inside Jungkook's jacket pocket. Do you think someone really wrote that for us? Jungkook smiled thoughtfully. I don't know. He looked up at the moons. But maybe not every gift needs an explanation. Jimin nodded. I like that answer. A cool breeze swept through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint fragrance of jasmine blooming from balconies overhead. Somewhere nearby, an old clock tower announced midnight with 12 slow melodic chimes. As they passed beneath the tower, they noticed a narrow staircase leading upward. A small wooden sign hung beside it. City Observation Deck *. Jimin looked toward the stairs. Should we? Jungkook laughed softly. You're never tired, are you? I am. Jimin smiled. But not tonight. They climbed the old stone staircase together. Each step creaked beneath their feet, the worn stones polished smooth by generations of visitors before them. When they finally reached the top, the entire city unfolded beneath the vast night sky. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon like constellations scattered across the earth. The river reflected the moon like a ribbon of silver. Far in the distance, the stadium where everything had begun stood quietly against the skyline. Jungkook leaned against the railing. It looks so small from here. Jimin followed his gaze. But last night, it felt like the whole universe. They stood quietly remembering. The whisper, the tears, the silence, the applause, everything that had changed in a single unforgettable moment. Jimin suddenly laughed. What? I just remembered something. Jungkook looked at him curiously. The first time we met. He covered his face with one hand, smiling with embarrassment. I thought you were intimidating. Jungkook blinked. Me? You looked so confident. I was terrified. Jimin laughed louder. You hid it well. So did you. They smiled at one another. Years of assumptions quietly dissolved into shared amusement. Jungkook rested his elbows on the railing. I thought you already had everything figured out. Jimin shook his head. I was just trying not to disappoint anyone. The words carried an honesty that no longer hurt. Only understanding remained. A faint melody drifted upward from somewhere below. An elderly man sat alone in the square beneath the tower, playing a piano that had been placed outside a small cafe. The melody was slow and gentle. Without speaking, Jungkook and Jimin listened. When the song ended, applause came only from a handful of late-night listeners. The pianist smiled modestly before beginning another piece. Jimin closed his eyes. I think music remembers things. Jungkook looked at him. What do you mean? Sometimes I hear a melody. And suddenly I remember a feeling before I remember the moment. Jungkook nodded slowly. I know exactly what you mean. He gently touched the silver ring beneath his shirt. This ring does the same thing. It reminds you. It reminds me of who I became after I stopped being afraid. Jimin smiled warmly. I think memories are supposed to do that. The breeze grew cooler. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon before revealing it once again. Jungkook reached into his pocket. He unfolded the mysterious paper crane one more time. On the reverse side, hidden within the folds, they noticed something they had missed earlier. A tiny drawing. 2 lanterns floating side by side across a river. Beneath them, in delicate handwriting, were 4 simple words. Keep choosing each other. Neither recognized the handwriting. Neither searched for an answer. Some messages seemed destined to remain anonymous. Not because their sender mattered less, but because their meaning mattered more. Jungkook carefully folded the paper once again. I'll never throw this away. I know. Jimin smiled. You keep everything important. Jungkook laughed. I learned from you. The eastern horizon had begun changing almost imperceptibly. A faint line of silver announced that dawn was only a few hours away. They descended the tower slowly before wandering toward the quiet neighborhood where their hotel overlooked the city. The streets were nearly empty. Only a florist was awake, arranging fresh flowers outside her tiny shop. As Jungkook and Jimin passed, she smiled kindly. Without saying a word, she picked a single white camellia from one of the buckets. She handed it to Jimin. Then another. She offered it to Jungkook. For beautiful journeys, she said softly. Before either could thank her, she returned to arranging the flowers with peaceful concentration. Jimin looked down at the delicate white bloom in his hand. Another unexpected gift. Jungkook gently twirled his own flower between his fingers. The city has been very kind to us. When they reached the hotel entrance, neither immediately walked inside. Instead, they remained standing beneath the quiet glow of the entrance lanterns. Jimin looked at the framed photograph tucked safely beneath his arm. Jungkook touched the silver ring around his neck. The letter, the notebook, the paper crane, the photograph, the white camellia. None of them had planned to collect these small treasures. Yet together they formed a story far richer than anything money could buy. Jungkook smiled gently. One day. What? We'll look back at this week. Jimin nodded. And we'll realize it wasn't the places we visited that changed us. Jungkook looked directly into his eyes. It was finally allowing ourselves to be seen. Jimin's smile was quiet, peaceful, and filled with certainty. I think we've been finding each other for years. The first birds began singing somewhere beyond the rooftops as the night slowly surrendered to another dawn. The city remained wrapped in silence, but inside that silence lived something neither of them had believed possible for so long. The comforting certainty that no matter how many tomorrows awaited them, they would never again mistake loneliness for strength, because they had finally discovered that the bravest hearts are not the ones that endure life alone, but the ones willing to let another heart walk beside them through every ordinary sunrise yet to come. The final morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a sky of soft blue that promised nothing extraordinary. The city awakened just as it always had. Cafe owners arranged chairs outside their shops. Cyclists glided through peaceful streets. Bells echoed gently from the old church tower. Birds circled above rooftops touched by the first light of dawn. Everything looked ordinary. Yet for Jungkook and Jimin, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. They stood together on the balcony of the hotel, looking toward the distant stadium where everything had begun only a few days before. From there, the enormous stage looked no different from any other building in the city. Jungkook smiled. It feels strange. Jimin leaned against the railing beside him. What does? I always believed the most important moment of my life would happen in front of thousands of people. He laughed softly. But it wasn't the crowd. It wasn't the lights. It wasn't even the stage. Jimin looked at him with quiet curiosity. What was it? Jungkook's fingers gently touched the silver ring hanging close to his heart. It was one honest sentence. The memory returned as vividly as if it had happened only seconds ago. If tomorrow the whole world forgets me, will you still stay beside me? Jimin smiled through eyes that shimmered with quiet emotion. My answer hasn't changed. It never will. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them no longer carried hidden fears. It carried understanding. After breakfast they packed their belongings. The framed photograph was wrapped carefully in soft cloth. The notebook rested safely inside Jimin's backpack, with Jungkook's letter still tucked between its pages. The folded paper crane remained inside Jungkook's wallet. The white camellias, now gently pressed between the pages of a book, would travel home with them as another memory preserved forever. Before leaving the city, they returned to one final place. The stadium. It stood completely empty. No music. No cheering. No dazzling lights. only rows upon rows of silent seats stretching into the distance. They walked slowly onto the stage. The same stage where thousands had cried. The same stage where one whispered question had changed everything. Morning sunlight streamed through the open roof, illuminating the polished floor where confetti from that unforgettable night had long since been swept away. Jimin walked toward the exact spot where Jungkook had taken his hand. He stopped. So this is where our story truly began. Jungkook smiled. No. Jimin looked at him. It began long before this. He walked closer until they stood side by side. This is only where we finally stopped pretending we couldn't hear each other's hearts. Jimin's eyes softened. I think you're right. The empty stadium echoed gently with every word. No audience remained. No cameras. No applause. Only truth. Jungkook reached into his pocket and unfolded the mysterious paper crane one final time. He carefully opened every crease until it became a flat square once again. On its blank reverse side, he wrote a single sentence. Thank you for leading us home. He folded it back into the shape of a crane. Together, they placed it beneath one of the empty seats in the front row. Not as something forgotten, but as a quiet gift for whoever might one day need hope as much as they once had. As they walked toward the exit, Jimin paused. Wait. Jungkook turned. Jimin stepped forward and embraced him without hesitation. No tears. No sadness. Only gratitude. When they finally stepped outside, sunlight greeted them warmly. The breeze carried the familiar scent of flowers through the air. The city looked exactly as it had before, yet they looked at it differently. Because people do not always need a new world to begin a new life. Sometimes they simply need the courage to see the old one with an open heart. Years passed. The silver ring never left Jungkook's neck. The framed photograph found its place on a quiet shelf beside well-loved books. The notebook continued to grow, filled not with fears anymore, but with moments of laughter, peaceful mornings, shared meals, handwritten dreams, and ordinary days that gradually became extraordinary simply because they were lived together. Whenever storms arrived, they still counted the seconds between lightning and thunder, laughing every time they accidentally counted differently. Whenever they passed an old bookstore, they looked for the blue book with the silver constellation, though they never found it again. Whenever they heard the melody from the music box, they smiled before either of them spoke. And every year on the anniversary of that unforgettable night, they returned to the stadium. Not for a performance, not for a celebration, simply to stand beneath the open sky, where thousands of lights had once illuminated two hearts finally brave enough to tell the truth. Visitors often wondered why the two smiled so peacefully while looking at an empty stage. No one knew. Some stories were never meant to become legends. They were meant to become lives. On one quiet evening many years later, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon and countless stars awakened overhead, Jimin gently rested his head against Jungkook's shoulder. Do you remember your question? Jungkook smiled. I'll never forget it. And do you know my favorite part? What? Jimin looked toward the endless sky where the first stars shimmered softly. You asked if I would stay beside you even if the whole world forgot. He reached for Jungkook's hand, their fingers naturally intertwining. But the truth is, his smile carried the same warmth it had beneath thousands of lights all those years ago. Love was never about being remembered by the whole world. It was always about making sure one heart never had to feel forgotten again. The evening breeze carried their quiet laughter into the fading light. Above them, countless stars continued shining, not because they wished to be seen, but because shining was simply their nature. And somewhere beyond the noise of the world, beneath an endless sky filled with gentle light, two hearts walked forward together without fear, knowing that the greatest promise they had ever made was not whispered beneath thousands of lights. It was fulfilled every ordinary day afterward. The end.